Let's break down our must-start defenses and streams for Week 13 of the fantasy season. These are the defenses with amazing upside, fantastic matchups, and the defenses that you have to start if you want to dominate your league mates in Week 13 of the fantasy season. All right, let's kick it off with the Jacksonville Jaguars on the road against the Tennessee Titans here in Week 13. 7 fantasy points in Week 12 against the Cardinals, and honestly, they weren't very impressive. They had 6 sacks, gave up a total of 18 points and 326 total yards, and that was it. No turnovers when they had 3 interceptions in 3 straight games, but I think they'll kind of bounce back here and get back to like that, 10 to 12 point fantasy range that they were in weeks 10 and 11, when they were actually getting interceptions and causing turnovers. Now, I will say, we've been streaming defenses all year long against Cam Ward and the Tennessee Titans, but this past week, the Titans offense did show up against the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, they were in a position where they needed to throw the football on a consistent basis, and this was the first game on the season in which Cam Ward did not have either a lost fumble or an interception. So his first turnover-free game, but I still like, any defense facing this Titans offense as still one of the worst offenses in the league, one of the most turnover-prone offenses in the league, with a total of 6 interceptions on the season for Cam Ward. And then we look at the lost fumbles on the season. We're looking at 6 total lost fumbles. So it's definitely there on a week-to-week basis. And I still like this Jaguars defense. They've still been very opportunistic on the entire season as a whole. So we know that the turnover potential will definitely be there. They have 13 interceptions and 5 forced fumbles on the entirety of the season. So they've been a little bit up and down here, a little bit sporadic, just 7 fantasy points this past week against the Cardinals. And they, as the game went on, and they did tend to kind of, break and almost gave up a victory to the Cardinals at the end of that game there. But in the day, they only set at 38% roster. So this is still a defense that you guys can pick up and stream. I think they have a very safe floor as we move into Week 13 of the season. Except let's take a look at the New Orleans Saints sitting at just 15% roster. They had 12 fantasy points in Week 12. Did give up 24 total points to the Falcons, but they had 3 sacks, a forced fumble, an interception, and a defensive score. And this is a defense that I've been talking about a bit lately because they have a really strong strength of schedule in the fantasy playoffs, getting the Panthers, the Jets, and the Titans. And I've been telling you guys, roster this team now, but let's go ahead and focus on Week 13 facing the Miami Dolphins, who are coming out of their bye week. This is a road game for the Saints, and I do kind of get a little nervous about teams coming out of their bye week, especially if they're at home. But we know with Tua Tagovailoa at the quarterback position, there's always the potential for turnovers, as he has had 3 interceptions in his last 3 games. To be fair, in his last matchup in Week 11, did have no turnovers, but the previous week, 2 interceptions, and the week before that, an interception. Then, we go back to Week 7, he had 3 interceptions. Go back to Week 6, another 3 interceptions. So the turnover potential is always there. And the Saints defense has kind of been quietly good, quietly improving as of late. And ultimately, they're just in a good spot. I think they have a really safe floor. But once again, maybe part of the reason of adding them and playing them has more to do with they're just worth rostering, holding on to for the fantasy playoffs. But once again, here in the short term, in Week 13, they're going to have turnover potential against Tua Tagovailoa and the Miami Dolphins. Next up, we have the LA Chargers coming out of their bye week, sitting at just 17% roster. The last time we saw them in action, -2 fantasy points against the Jaguars. They've only averaged 5.7 fantasy points per game on the season, 5 forced fumbles, a fumble recovery, but they do have 10 interceptions, and we know that this secondary for the Chargers is the strength of that defense. They're very opportunistic on a week-to-week basis, and they're going to face Geno Smith and the Raiders this week. And we look since Week 9 of the season, we have a turnover in every game for Geno Smith. No interceptions this past week for Geno, but he had 2 fumbles, one of them lost. And in the previous 3 games, he has thrown an interception in every single game. So, I mean, there's still some rumblings out there that, like, Aiden O'Connell or Kenny Pickett or another quarterback could come into play here, but it also feels like Pete Carroll's just stubborn right now and is going to play Geno Smith and nobody else. So we're going to continue to stream opposing defenses against the Raiders and Geno Smith. So this is another team very lowly rostered at 17% rostered coming out of their bye week. So they were, rostered on certain teams. They definitely got dropped, especially after they also had negative fantasy points the previous week. So I think they're a really strong play, especially if you guys are not happy with your current defense. The Chargers should be out there and a strong streaming option here in Week 13. Next up, let's talk about the Houston Texans. They are very highly rostered at 75% rostered, but 15 fantasy points this past week against the Buffalo Bills, only gave up 19 total points, 8 sacks, a forced fumble recovery, and 2 interceptions against Josh Allen and company. And the reason why I do want to talk about them is because they did get dropped in a lot of leagues. Maybe not a lot of leagues, but around like 25% of leagues because, going into week 11, this team was almost 100% rostered. Then they got the Bills in week 12, and sometimes people just make that tough cut and go ahead and try and stream a defense against, or when their defense is playing a better offense like the Bills. But this Texans defense is legit. If they are not the best defense in the league, they're one of the very best defenses in the league. They've had 10 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games on the season so far, 12 interceptions, 2 defensive scores, 8 forced fumbles, 6 fumble recoveries, 33 sacks. And I also think some people are a little bit worried, like they weren't just looking at Buffalo in week 12. They're also looking at the fact that they play the Colts and the Chiefs in the next 2 weeks. But this Texans defense is a defense that we can start on a week-to-week basis. No matter who they are starting, they're going to give you a safe floor, and they always have the potential to get you double-digit fantasy points. And still, Daniel Jones, since week 9 of the season, 4 interceptions and 3 lost fumbles. I know he was pretty clean this past week against the Chiefs. No turnovers this past week, but still, ultimately, you got to feel good if you own the Texans. You can go ahead and roll with them. They have a very safe floor. If they got dropped in your league, they are a must-add defense moving into week 13. Next up, let's talk about the Atlanta Falcons. 46% rostered, 16 fantasy points this past week. They only gave up 4 points, 5 sacks on the day, a forced fumble, and an interception against Tyler Shuck and the New Orleans Saints. They're on the road this week against the Jets, and I will go ahead and say, this is like the most sporadic up and down defense and team in the NFL. Like anytime we talk about the Falcons, I feel like the following week they just don't perform, so we stop talking about them. I mean, they had 12 fantasy points in week 9, 14 in week 10, like them against the Panthers in week 11. They had 4 fantasy points against Bryce Young and company and got absolutely torched. Then this past week, they showed up against the Saints with 16 fantasy points, and now they're going to get Tyrod Taylor and the Jets, who have, a very few offensive weapons, although, John Mechie has shown up and Breece Hall is still making some waves in that offense. This is still an offense that's struggling. Tyrod Taylor threw an interception this past week against the Ravens. They just gave up a double-digit fantasy day to the Ravens defense. So there's another team still lowly rostered enough that you may be able to pick them up off of the waiver wire, and I do get a little nervous about them because they've been so up and down on the season so far, but still, they should be a solid add if you guys need help moving into week 13. Next up, we have the Seattle Seahawks. They do sit at 92% roster, but I want to talk about them because they had just 4 fantasy points against a really bad Titans offense this past week. Gave up 24 total points, 4 sacks, 296 yards allowed, no turnovers, but ultimately, you got to feel good. I mean, I know since week 9, we're looking at 8 or less fantasy points in 3 matchups, 23 fantasy points against the Cardinals, but there has definitely been some very low ceiling games, and they're one of the highest roster defenses in fantasy football right now. But I would encourage you guys to go ahead and leave them in your starting lineup as they play J.J. McCarthy and the Vikings here in week 13 at home. And McCarthy's coming off a game where he had a fumble. It wasn't a lost fumble, but still a fumble. 2 interceptions and only threw 87 passing yards. The previous week, 150 passing yards. That's it, and 2 interceptions. The week before that, 2 interceptions. The week before that, a fumble and an interception. Tons of turnovers for this Vikings offense right now. J.J. McCarthy playing nowhere near like even decent quarterback play right now. We really need to start, looking at what defenses are playing J.J. McCarthy and the Vikings on a week-to-week basis, although we did talk about the Packers in last week's video. But this is another team that we have to feel good about on a week-to-week basis in terms of streaming again. So hold on to the Seahawks defense. I know it's been rough. It was disappointing this past week, but they are still a must-start defense here in week 13 of the season. Let's not forget about the Denver Broncos, sitting at 82% rostered coming out of their bye week. Fortunately, a lot of people out there held on to the Broncos, held them through the bye week, but if they got dropped in your league, you need to go add them because they're facing Marcus Mariota and the Washington Commanders in week 13, then Geno Smith and the Las Vegas Raiders in week 14. It gets a little bit stiffer after that. Through the fantasy playoffs, they have the Packers, Jaguars, and Chiefs. little bit up and down there, but these next 2 weeks are going to be a very, very strong play on a week-to-week basis. They're still the defense 3 in terms of fantasy scoring on the year. 5 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, 6 interceptions, 49 sacks. They've only given up 190 total points. So, like last year, they caused a lot more turnovers, but this year, although they don't have as many turnovers, they're in total allowing very, very little points on a week-to-week basis. So they're a really strong play here in week 13 of the season. They got dropped. You guys need to add them. They're going to be a really strong play over the next 2 weeks, and I think one of the better overall plays in week 14 when you guys are making that final push into the fantasy playoffs. Last but not least, let's talk about the Baltimore Ravens, another highly rostered team here, sitting at 89% rostered. 12 fantasy points in week 12, just 10 points allowed against the Jets. They had 3 sacks, a forced fumble, a fumble recovery, and an interception. Here in week 13 of the season, they're going to face the Cincinnati Bengals. Maybe it's Joe Flacco this week. Maybe it's Joe Burrow. We'll find out on Thanksgiving Day. The reports are indicating that there could be a push for Joe Burrow to return to action in Week 13, and the Bengals are going to absolutely need to win this game in Week 13 to have any hopes of a playoff push. And the Ravens also need to win this game to continue their current, playoff push, moving outside of the playoff bubble. So this is a big matchup for both sides. I do think the Ravens are slightly risky this week if Burrow plays, but also T. Higgins is banged up, dealing with that concussion. The Bengals could be missing some offensive weapons. Maybe Burrow isn't good to go. If Flacco's the starting quarterback, then I love the Ravens this week. But ultimately, they're just a defense worth talking about. They've had 10 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games. They have been one of the softer defenses, in terms of the season as a whole. They had some really, really bad defensive performances. Look, between weeks 1 and 5, they had negative fantasy points in every game except for week 2 against the Browns. So they still rank pretty low overall, but they've gotten a lot healthier over the past couple weeks since they've came out of the bye week, and that has really shown. Like I said, double digits in 3 of the last 4. They've looked really good over the past 2 weeks. This is still a strong defensive team to start in week 13 this season. Like I said, I love them if it's Joe Flacco at the starting quarterback position. If it's Burrow, I still think the Ravens have a pretty safe floor moving into week 13. Guys, have it there, my must-start defenses and streams for Week 13 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously if you guys subscribe and hit that like button on the way out. And make sure you guys go check out last week's video from Friday. We did a video breaking down the best defenses to stream for the fantasy playoffs based on strength of schedule. And keep posted, because I will post another video like that with updated rankings and everything in another week or 2. And with that being said, when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, go check out all of our Week 13 fantasy content. As the week progresses, we'll have everything here on the channel that you could possibly need to dominate this week of fantasy football. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.